Welcome everyone to the Nikhil Hogan Show. My guest today is music scholar and pianist Professor Gaetano Stella, an expert on the subject of Partimento and particularly Partimento in the 19th century and also music pedagogy with Partimento. Professor Stella, welcome to the Nikhil Hogan Show.
Thank you very much.
Tell me a little bit about yourself, how you got your start in music and how you ended up where you are today.
So I began to study piano at 12 in a family without any tradition in music. So It was a total free choice of me. And after that, I studied choir conducting, orchestra conducting, composition. And in the meantime, I studied musicology. So I graduated with Giorgio Sanguinetti. After that, I took the PhD under his guidance too. Nowadays, I'm currently piano teacher at the Musical Lyceum in Rome. But I continue to divide myself in teaching practical music, pedagogy, as you said, and so I have a multi-faced activity and interests too.
Excellent. So you mentioned Professor Giorgio Sanguinetti. Can you describe or mention when you met him and how that came about?
Oh, okay. Giorgio, it was really an important person in my life because I met him when I was an adult. I was 28 or 29 when I met him because I first enrolled in another university in Rome where it was possible to study music, but music history only. After that, I knew that was opened a new in another university a course in musicology. So with a lot of subjects in music theory, aesthetics, and so on. So I decided to change, and I arrived in the university where Giorgio taught. So I became a pupil of him.
What year was this when you met him?
Oh, what year? 1998.
So this is well before The Art of Partimento, which was published in 2012.
Well before The Art of Partimento. I studied with him harmony, counterpoint, but I have already studied composition. So I had a strong basis in composition, and but it was really interesting to me to see, to reorientate the study I previously had. In some sense, I followed obviously a very traditional course in composition in Italy, and in that period, Giorgio was really a strong Schinkerian.
Right.
That Giorgio had a strong formation as a Schinkerian theorist. So in that period, for me, was something totally new, and it was really interesting to me to look again at harmony and counterpoint under a new point of view. Under a point that for me was quite new, because Schinkerians in Italy are not a lot still today. Still today, I know that for Anglo-Saxon people, for English-speaking countries, it became a really famous and quite frequently taught approach, but in Italy still today is not. So it was really interesting.
What is the most popular way of analysis, mainstream in Italy?
If I would answer in a provocative way, I probably could answer the recent.
Okay.
You have to think that in Italy, music is still taught in two different, in two totally separated ways. One way is in the conservatories, and conservatories are exclusively for musicians, for people who will become a musician. So they study a lot of practical subjects obviously, instrumental performance, and some nowadays a lot of theoretical subjects, but practically oriented. Another totally separated way is to study music in universities. Universities has some courses in musicology, so you can graduate and to take a PhD too in musicology. But it's another approach, and it's quite a young way, because the courses in musicology in Italy has perhaps something like 30 or 40 years. Previously, you could study history of music inside the courses in humanities, but it wasn't possible to specialize in musicology. So analysis in our tradition is something quite different from what everybody nowadays consider to be music analysis. Music analysis was something for the student of composition. So something to look at the composition of the great composers, to learn to compose. So this different point of view changed a lot of things. For example, the difference in the harmony treatises between prescriptive books and descriptive books. So the first ones are for composers. The second one are more useful for musicologists.
Right, there's a separation then. And isn't it true that, I've heard this, that in Italy, if you major in composition, you have to get locked in a room and write for hours an exam.
Yeah.
So and it's serious counterpoint, right?
Yeah, I didn't completed that way, because I stopped at the 7th here.
Gosh, it's 10 years. Wow, it's just like the Naples Conservatory.
It was a 10 years
wow.
Course. Yeah. I ended at 7th because the 7th was necessary to begin orchestra conducting, and anyway for the 7th here exam was you had to remain closed in a room for 18 hours. First proof, another 18 hours. The second proof, first proof was fugue, the composition of a fugue. The second proof was a composition, the realization of a double choir in 8 voices, and the third proof was a romance for piano. in late 19th century style, and after that an oral speech with the commission.
This is very interesting, because it's going to tie in with what we're going to talk about in a minute, which is basically pedagogy and how it's changed from the 18th to the 19th century. But before we really get into that, I still want to ask a little bit about you. When did Partamento become a part of your life?
This is really a curious thing, because in some sense I had my first approach to some elements of Partimento when I was quite young. When I was 18, when I began to study composition, and my teacher of composition obliged me to do cadences, rule of the octave, and other stuffs directly at the piano in all the keys, major, minor, all the position. Simply saying to me, do this way, don't worry about the theory, this is the realization, you have simply to practice, after we will speak. Play first, and after we will talk about it. At that epoch, I was totally unaware about what it was. Many years later...
Was it continuo, or did they describe it as continuo?
Yes, in some sense it was a continuo too, but you know that Partimento and continuo at a very basic level share a lot of elements. The basic theory is the same, is quite the same. Continuists and partimentists had to practice the same things at the basic level. So cadences, rule of the octave, suspensions, and so on. So it was my first contact. So many years later, when I met Giorgio, and Giorgio started to study Partimenti, so I could link these two different experiences and say, oh, but what I did when I was 18, it was the same, the same basics. And so my teacher of composition was trained in Naples. Okay. So she's nowadays she's something like 80, 85, 86 years old, right. And she was the last pupil of Achille Longo. Achille Longo
what's your teacher's name?
Teresa Procaccini. Teresa Procaccini, she's quite a famous composer, a female composer. And she had quite a good career. She is still played in many countries, and she was
an improviser as well.
She's a wonderful improviser, and she's a good demonstration on how many things in teaching composition were fading or changing or disappearing. For example, she's a great improviser, but she didn't teach to improvise to his pupils.
Really?
Of his pupils. Yeah, because it was a skill no more requested for examinations, for example. So many skills they had. I refer to her generation. Many skills they had to develop when they were young. They don't thought to their pupils because they were no more requested. So the education changed. So she's still able to do, but she didn't transmit it to us.
So she was your teacher when you were in the 7 years of the conservatory?
She was my teacher, yeah. She was my teacher in composition.
And was she aware of Partimento, or is that something you brought to her?
This is another, in some sense, funny thing, because when I spoke a few years ago to her about Partimenti, her first reaction was, oh, but you are speaking about that very old thing that nobody nowadays use. Which use can you do? So they knew the name, but no, not the practice.
Okay.
Anyway, they knew Fenaroli, of course, but and the other authors of Partimenti, but no more the practice. That is. So, but even if the practice disappeared, this is an interesting element of the Partimento practice during the 19th century. Some practices disappeared, some others changed, were reorientated in some sense. After, if you want, we can go to
that's
this
aspect.
That's
really a good link, because you mentioned she had a teacher that was very famous.
Yeah, Achille Longo was quite a famous teacher in Naples. Achille Longo was a pupil of Antonio Savasta. Savasta was another quite a famous musician in Naples at the very beginning of the 20th century. In that days, they had still a memory of the tradition. You have to think that one of the latest exponents of the so-called Napolitans, Pietro Platania, was the dean of the conservatory until.
Great name. Okay. You bring up these names, then they're part of a really excellent article, Partimenti in the Age of Romanticism, Raimondi, Platania, and Bucheron. So let's actually get right into it. I think we're ready now. So first of all, let's lay the groundwork. The 19th century and the 18th century. What are the key differences that we should be aware of when discussing Partimento of the 19th century versus the 18th century? Let's take a broad general overview first.
Yeah, but at first, probably I should mention that the main difference may be the fact that in the 18th century, Partimento was generally improvised. During the 19th century, it was increasingly a written out practice. It took quite a long period, because you have to think that, for example, Platania himself, he was trained in the improvised Partimento. He continued to teach improvised Partimento, but when he was old, he assisted to this really huge change of direction, and so he participated in some sense to this change of use. So at the end of the century, Partimento was a totally written out practice. No more no more an improvised practice. I think this is one of the main difference. Obviously, during the century, Partimento absorbed all the novelties about harmony, chromatic harmony, the change in forms. For example, this is another interesting cue. You know that in the 18th century, Partimento was not only fugue, Partimento fugue, but it was a concerto in the form of a concerto movement, or in a form of all the other forms that were used in real composition.
Right.
In the 19th century, this is interesting to me, you can see the same, but with the new forms. So, for example, in the Partimenti of Platania, you can find Partimento Etude, or
like Chopin, that kind of
thing. Yeah, not exactly. Probably Platania was not so well gifted as Chopin. But the idea is that one. The idea is to merge didactic and real composition with the forms that were usual in that days, with the language that is not completely contemporary, probably 2 or 3 decades of delay. So, for example, Partimento of Platania was composed probably in the 50s of the 19th century, and you can see the style of something like a Schumann or first Romanticism. So a little bit old-fashioned, if you want, but anyway, it was still the kind of music that everybody wrote and composed in that days. So it changed the form, but remained the same the purpose. The purpose was to train the composer to write real music, and to be trained in what the composer was expected to write. And in this sense, the purpose remained exactly the same as in the 18th century.
It's known that Fenaroli had the most popular collection of Partimenti published in Europe. I think there's no contesting that statement. But is it true that...
yeah, of course.
But is it true that the Partimenti, and I didn't know this, of the great masters like Francesco Durante and Leonardo Leo, they were never published? Is that true? Not completely. And you can find some anthology at the end of the centuries. At the end of the 19th century, were published some collections of Partimenti, so were collected some Partimenti of many. But never like under their name, like Fenaroli's was.
No, never. Fenaroli was really a milestone of pedagogy in the 19th century.
Right.
You have to, as probably you know, a lot of editions, a lot of reprints. It was continuously used for more than a century in Italian conservatories. Yeah.
Before we get to Raimondi and Platania, can you talk about how the writings of Emanuele Bimbo actually inspired music educators in the UK, the United Kingdom, like Bell and Lancaster for their schools? Could you talk about that?
Yeah. It's another interesting story. Emanuele Bimbo, as you know, was trained in Naples. He went to France, where he made quite a good career, and he published a kind of pamphlet sur l'enseignement mutuel. And where he described the pamphlet is not totally devoted to this, but anyway, in part of this pamphlet, he describes the way of teaching in the Napolitan conservatories. It's one of the few writings we have about this. How was organized practically the didactics in Naples, and how they did. And you have to think that the pupils lived together for many years. You know that Robert Geldingen described really well, also in his last book, Child Composers, these stuffs. But I believe it's quite good to mention again this. They lived together. They shared life, food, prayers, music for years. And the organization of the conservatories used quite well all the opportunities that came out from this situation. For example, the presence of so-called mastricelli was an element of this. You know that mastricelli were enough trained composer, advanced pupils, that they were put under contract. They had to pass a competition, to an internal competition to become mastricelli, so young maestri, the word that has this meaning, young maestri, and they were part of a chain of transmission of knowledge. At the head of the pyramid was the maestro. The maestro. Halfway was were the mastricelli. At the basis, all the pupils. So, the pupils received the lessons not only by maestro, but from mastricelli too. But in the meantime, they received continuously lessons by all their colleagues, because they lived together. So it was quite easy to ask, for example, to one of the fellows.
There might be one kid who is further along than everyone. You can always ask him questions. You know how you copy homework, you know?
Yeah, but the problem, it was not copying. The problem, it was of this kind, I believe, but it was always possible. It was always possible to complete, for example, a lacking part of your homework with the knowledge of somebody else. To ask at midnight, Francesco, how did you complete that homework? I wasn't able. Can you help me?
Yeah.
Obviously, we can make laugh at this kind of thing, but it was a really
very good
and a totally immersive situation of apprehensionship. So they could learn 20 hours a day, every day for years.
Is that what Mbimbo was writing? He wrote about his experiences.
Mbimbo wrote about this. Wrote about a kind of organization that was a mutual apprehension. Nowadays we call it cooperative learning.
Right.
Cooperative learning, and in multi-level classes, so with the young and older pupils that had to learn together, and they each other profited about this situation, because the older ones had to, in explaining to the younger ones, had to consolidate their knowledge. Because if you teach, so you know that nothing is more brightening in your head than to have to explain something to somebody else. When you have to transmit it, you have to clarify totally what you are speaking about. Other way, the pupil is not able to understand. So, for example, I'm a teacher. We said it before. Every day when I teach, usually I say that I continuously learn from my pupils in exactly as I hope I hope they learn from me. Because when I have continually to explain some stuff in my activity, in my everyday activity, I have every time to clarify better what I'm speaking about. And for example, during the years, I looked at me teaching, and I'm able to see to say that nowadays I really more fast, more effective, and because from time to time you are able to cross out what is not useful, what may create confusion in the head of the pupils. So you are every time most centered to the end, in some sense. I hope to have answered to your question. So it was the same. It was the same with that kind of apprehension.
In the UK, is that what happened? So
the passage in the UK was it's curious. Giorgio spoke about it in his book Partimento, The Art of Partimento. Lancaster read the pamphlet of Bimbo, so he was inspired by the description of Bimbo, and so probably we can say that all the movement of the schools that started in London in the UK in the second half of 19th century was inspired in the heads of Lancaster and Bell from the pamphlet of Emanuele Bimbo sull'enseignement mutuel, the mutual teaching. So each pupil can teach to another, and together they learn better and in a more deep way. This kind of experience, it was described, it's curious because there are a lot of links in the pedagogy of 20th century. For example, I have a lapsus at this moment, quite a famous pedagogist, a Russian pedagogist, that stressed a lot the importance of social connection in the learning. If you are, for example, the transmission from a mother to his child is strongly facilitated by the feelings that a child has for his mother. No.
Okay.
So when you are able to create something like that in a school, for example, or in a group of children, you have really at your disposal a great tool to use, because everything you teach may be reinforced by the social connection, by affectivity, and in Naples there was something like that. As I told you, they lived together for years, so there was friendship. There were a lot of things that were developed during the years.
Excellent. Now let's jump to Pietro Raimondi, who is connected to Leonardo Leo. Is that correct?
Yeah, Pietro Raimondi was the teacher of Pietro Platania, two Pietros in our speech.
Pietro is Peter, right? Is that the Italian
Peter.
way of Peter? Okay.
Yeah. The way of Peter.
So St. Peter's Basilica is San Pietro.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
In fact, I was saying quite an important name for Catholics, because it's the first of the
popes, yeah.
Of the 12 apostles. The first one was Pietro. So Pietro.
Yeah. So he was he a direct student of Leonardo Leo, or just part of? He was like a student of a student.
He was in the genealogy of the Leists.
Okay.
At the moment, I don't remember who was exactly his teacher, but you have to think that usually most of the Neapolitan composers were pupils of more maestri.
Okay.
It was quite rare to find somebody that was a pupil simply of one one maestro.
Okay.
And that is, for example, a problem in the reconstruction of the genealogy of Durantisti and Leisti, because quite often composers were pupils of both the sides. So it's not always so easy. But in the for Raimondi, we can say that it is totally in the tradition of Leisti, because you can find it in the particular form he gave to his fugues.
Can you respond to this quote from Wikipedia? I don't know if this is correct because it's Wikipedia, but it says about Raimondi, he was obsessed with counterpoint. He spent his spare time writing fugues for many voices, as well as simultaneous fugues in different keys and modes for multiple groups of different instruments. He considered this work to be experimental. So he was very big into counterpoint.
He was one of the more important exponents in the so-called gigantistic counterpoint. So that is to say, compositions for a lot of real voices. For example, he composed 2 operas in one. That is a
Wait, what does that mean? 2 operas in one.
It means that he composed an opera, a double opera, to be played on 2 stages with 2 orchestras with 2 separated plots, but to be played together.
How does that work?
So quite an hard task. And
so it's like 2 stories, and then like maybe one takes a break, another one takes over, and then it just kind of goes staggered, and then they both resolve kind of at the same time.
If you want, it's
like a movie with like 2 different threads, right? Like 2 different story points in a movie, something like that.
Something like that. But obviously, it was mostly a demonstration of skills, of ability in managing complex counterpoint.
And so the students of the Leonardo Leo lineage, so that was cantus firmus, like Fuchs, and then they wrote above and below the cantus firmus. Is that how they learned their counterpoint?
Despite the excellent works of Peter Ravantoul, he studied really in depth the apprehension of counterpoints. About the 19th century, it's not completely clear if they began counterpoint during the studying of Partimento or after that. And in any case, if you look at the course and counterpoint, we have a lot of manuscripts of that period, obviously. You can see it was a quite different way to learn counterpoint. For example...
So we have a lot of counterpoint manuscripts from the 19th century.
There are quite a lot. In Naples, in the library of the conservatory, but it was quite a different way to learn it. But it was the same at the end of 18th century. It was first of all a totally tonal-oriented counterpoint.
What do you mean by that?
This is I mean that they began exercises in counterpoint, realizing cadences, rule of the octave, suspensions, so the same things that they had to do with the Partimenti, but under another point of view, so perhaps I may say counterpointally oriented, or in a more horizontal way to look at these stuffs. But the beginning was exactly about the same things, so cadences in 2 voices, or rule of the octave in 2 or 3 voices. So looking at the horizontal movements of the parts, but doing the same things. I believe that it was quite an idiomatic way to learn counterpoint. And for example, this is totally different from the way of Fuchs, the counterpoint of species. But in my opinion, it was something similar that occurred, for example, in the use of Latin during in the Middle Age or during the Renaissance. For example, that in the Middle Age, all the intellectuals spoke fluently Latin. They used Latin to communicate, to write, that is. In this use of Latin, in this everyday use of Latin, Latin changed a lot along the centuries. So we can speak of a medieval Latin.
Okay.
That is quite different from the classical Latin, for example, of Cicero.
Right.
When the Renaissance started, the humanists they looked for a full recovery of the classical Latin. So they defined the medieval one a corrupted Latin. So for example, the Latin of Church was defined corrupted because it wasn't the Latin of Cicero. It was quite different. In doing this, they condemned the Latin to the death because it tended to be an everyday language. It became only
scholarly in that regard, is that?
Yeah, it became only a scholarly way of communication, and it was the end of the Latin. In some sense, in my opinion, with counterpoint, we could say something similar. When Fuchs started, you know that he wasn't the inventor of the counterpoint of species, because there are a lot of theorists that
okay.
Angelo Berardi, for example.
Okay.
Other theorists do the same before him. But
my understanding is he went to Italy to get trained. In that, his method is essentially teaching the Palestrina style.
Yeah. So, but Palestrina style wasn't the style of the times of Fuchs.
It was an older style that he was codifying.
So it was an out of date style. or another time style. So what was the purpose to train young people in a style totally out of date? And in fact, in Naples, they refused this way to think. In Naples, they did a tonal counterpoint because it was the counterpoint that was needed in the everyday practice.
So tonal counterpoint is not modal then. It's kind of the major and minor counterpoint of the 18th century. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perhaps with some complications, because you have to think that until the first decades of the 19th century.
So this is like Cherubini's counterpoint, that sort of style.
No, quite different from Cherubini. Well, in the Cherubini treatise, you can find something about it, but if you want to look at the real use of Neapolitan counterpoint, you must look to Nicola Sala.
Okay.
Nicola Sala is really the summa theologica of counterpoint of Neapolitan counterpoint.
No kidding.
At the very end
was Nicola Sala? He was a student of Leo, right? Did he teach Raimondi?
I have to confess that at this moment I don't remember who were the teachers of Raimondi. As I told you, sorry, but I don't remember.
I want you to respond to this quote by Raimondi, which I found very interesting. He said, "With the greatest sorrow, I heard from some ill-advised young people that in order to compose works in whatever genre it was enough to know the principles of voice leading and to write some solfeggi without wasting time in the study of fugue." So why was he sad about this state of affairs? What was it in the study of fugue that a young composer can benefit from?
First of all, I was to quote a funny story by Florimo regarding Vincenzo Bellini. You know that Bellini was a pupil of Nicola Zingarelli. Florimo refers that one time when the young Bellini went to greeting his maestro at the conservatory, his maestro told him, you write quite well for opera, but remember, in the counterpoint, you are a donkey. A donkey. I don't know.
A donkey. Oh my.
A donkey. So a lot of old maestri at the beginning of 19th century had a lot of sadness, a kind of sadness for the feeling that something was fading away.
Quick question, is that because there was more money in opera than there was in perhaps church music?
This is a good point. Obviously, opera was quite a rich, operatic one was quite a rich career. So offered best situation, cachets, and so on. And opera in the 19th century didn't have the same use of counterpoint that in the past. But in the second half of the 18th century, perhaps you could say the same. Counterpoint was more used in church music too, because operatic music was quite different at the end of the 18th century. So for Raimondi, but for Platania too, this was a word to be preserved in some sense, because they strongly believed that even if the style was changed, even if the skills requested to composers were changing the same, but the
good
same
to know
was,
these skills.
Good to know these skills, because through the skills, the formation was more complete, more flexible, more inside inside the music itself, in some sense.
Now, Professor Stella, back when I was in college and we did music history, the way that 19th century Romantic music was described was that it had greater freedom of form, as we just talked about earlier. It had chromatic harmonies, more dissonances, daring modulations. Did 19th century Partimento, and we're talking now about Platania and Raimondi, did they add these characteristics to Partimento?
So, first of all, I think we have to distinguish among two different kinds of chromatism. There is, how can I say, a subsidiary or accessorial chromaticism, that is to say, an ornamental chromaticism, as quite often you can see, for example, in the music of Chopin. And that is another kind of chromaticism that go more in depth in the musical composition.
Is that melodically in terms of the way the diminutions are, the notes in between?
That is.
We're not talking about the harmony here. We're talking about kind of like the melodic lines.
Okay, and the second one that is more in depth, because it's about the structure of music, and so this is another kind of chromaticism. So Platania tried really to introduce in the practice of Partimento the first type of chromaticism, but you can hardly find the second one. The second one was in some sense out of the Neapolitan tradition.
The second one is the harmony, the chords.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, you can find obviously some chromatic chords, but introduced always under a counterpointal point of view. This is another element. For example, all the European theorists had to travel a lot to justify theoretically all the chromatic harmony, because in some sense they feel that the chromatic harmony could broke the stability of tonality.
Let's get an example here. So this is 19th century harmony. We're not talking about Debussy. We're not talking about Ravel. We're talking about perhaps like Chopin and Schumann and that sort of thing.
For example, the augmented triad chord, no, or were written were written treatises about it, how to justify the use of these chords that the composer used, but the problem was in the school. How to give a theoretical justification to this kind of chords.
The augmented chord, so the raised fifth.
For example,
Okay.
in the list, for example, in the Listians, but Platania used this kind of chords, but in some sense is like it was more facilitated in this use, looking at this under a counterpointal point of view. If I look not vertically at music, but horizontally, so if are the melodic movement that creates this kind of chords, it is less problematic, because if the horizontal movements are correct, I have no need to give an explanation for everything.
So if we could try and explain that technically, for instance, there's in the Neapolitan method, in the Partamento, you have dissonances, the 4, 7, and the 9, but they have to be prepared. Is that one characteristic of the 19th century? And if we're talking horizontally, you don't have to prepare some of these dissonances?
Not always. Not always, because, for example, Platania in his harmony treatise says that in some situations the dissonances.
Oh, he has a harmony treatise. So people can download that.
Yeah. There is an harmony treatise. I believe is now free in the digital materials of the Italian SBN.
That's cool.
He says, for example, that in some situations, dissonances may be not prepared or not resolved if they are hidden by other voices. There are some situations in which dissonances are not so openly audible. So he stresses a lot the importance of hearing. What I'm really able to hear. Music is not done for reading, is done for hearing. So if I'm not able to distinguish the movement of this dissonance, what's the problem?
So you're saying that you have more freedom, but you have to make sure the voices allow for it to either hide it so that it's not. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in some sense, yeah. If the dissonance is hidden by another voice that has more importance for a rhythmic
what do you mean by
reason,
hidden? So you really have to explain, because I'm not an expert. So hidden means
that in the perception, when you hear, there are some dissonances that are really quite evident. No, because they are accented, for example, or because they are in a strong position, or in the top voice. So in these cases, you have to put really a lot of care in the use of dissonances. But in other cases, when there is another voice that take take the importance on it, so the dissonance in some sense is shadowed in the perception. So if you are not, I know it's quite a different idea of harmony. So, if the dissonance is shadowed, if it's not so important in the perception, how I have to take care of it?
Do you resolve them? Do you have to, like, leading tone has to rise and that sort of thing, and fourth scale
the leading
has
tone,
to fall?
obviously, Platania was very strict about the tradition. So the leading tone, the seventh chord has their normal resolution, but he showed some cases in which it was possible to avoid the strict rules, using the principle of what I am hearing. If it's possible to hear or not. If it is not, what's the matter?
Right. Now, you mentioned that Raimondi, his theoretical works there was a romantic nature to it.
Raimondi was quite different by his pupil Platania. For example, in his pedagogical works, he was really quite strict. His exercises of partimenti, bassi, imitati, e fugati, and so on were quite strict in the use of the rules. He was perhaps more tied to the tradition. But in my opinion, and it was one of the reasons I put Raimondi together with Platania and Boucheron in my article of the Journal of Music Theory, Raimondi participated too in the movement of shifting in the Partimento tradition in the 19th century. For example, he was one of the first to carry the Partimento in the written out form. For example, his Bassi, Imitati e Fugati was written for a written out realization, not for an improvised one. So in this sense, he was one of the romantic composers of Partimenti, because the Partimento, as I said before, became a written out practice. But the style, is another thing. Platania, it was completely a composer of his time, even if a little bit pedantic sometimes, but anyway, a composer of his times.
And what do you mean by that?
That he wrote with he began to write when he was young as a bel canto composer, and when he was old, he ended his career in a style quite close to the verismo.
What is that? What's that? The later style? Could you repeat that again?
Verismo.
Verismo. What is verismo?
Like Giordano, Cilea, Mascagni.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay. So during his career, he really followed the style of his times. So he was born in the 1828. He died in the 1907, and so he followed the different styles of the different epochs. Raimondi was more conservative, was more tied, but to the old times in some sense.
If we can talk about figured and unfigured bases, Platania apparently was adamant on unfigured bases more than his teacher. But he is also more of a 19th century, in the vein of a 19th century composer compared to his teacher. So if he's doing unfigured bases, is the harmony still kind of conservative, or would you have more different harmonies even though it is unfigured?
Platania shared with his maestri the opinion that the pupil had to be able to realize Partimento without figures. He says he says it clearly in the introduction of his treatise of harmony. But in the meantime, he shared with his teacher Raimondi the idea that each Partimento, but it was the same in the past, each Partimento may be realized at different levels of difficulties. So there is always an easy way to realize a Partimento, and increasingly more complex ways to realize a Partimento. So obviously the starting point is the same. If you look at the treatise of Platania, you can find the cadences, the rule of the octave, and so on. So the identical stuffs.
Is it identical then, Professor Stella, or are there such things as like a 19th century way of doing a cadence, a romantic way of doing the rule of the octave, a more elaborated cadence? Do you know what I mean? So like, for instance, more romantic stylings, romantic patterns.
There are some, but at more advanced level. The basis remains quite the same as in Fenaroli. But at the more advanced level, you can find some suggestions, for example, of a more chromatic realization of the rule of the octave, of some kind of suspensions. But are mostly of the first kind of chromaticism I spoke about. So it's a melodic way to an ornamental, a melodic way. I spoke about Chopin, for example, because he Chopin did quite often use of Partimento patterns in his compositions.
So could you give some examples of that?
For example, the very beginning of the Etude Opus 25, number 2. The very beginning of the etude is a rule of the octave. It's based on the rule of the octave. The problem, if you want to call this way, is that the rule of the octave is hidden inside a lot of notes of figuration, a lot of diminution, if you want. So it's a romantic way to diminish the rule of the octave. But if you cross out all the ornamental notes, you can find purely a first half of the first with 3/5, second degree with 6/4/3, and so on. For in the fantasy, F minor fantasy for piano, you can find some examples of the 6/5 progression.
Oh, the Moti del Basso, the 6/5.
Yeah, the Moti del Basso. That is.
Can we do a few more? I'm sure the audience would love that. If we could just mention more examples of 19th century music where there are clear Partimento patterns.
You know that the beginning of the impromptu number Opus 142, number 2, if I remember well, the A flat major by Franz Schubert. This is another good example of the rule of the octave. Mi, la, la, si, la, sol, si, la, si, do. It's a totally rule of the octave based theme. But Giuseppe Verdi, Va pensiero sulle ali dorate from Nabucco is a rule of the octave the same. But in my opinion, is not really surprising. If you want to speak about rule of the octave was one of the first rules that every pupil in composition learned in that times. So what was more obvious to use than one of the first things you learned? It's like I'm speaking with you and I'm speaking mostly using subject verb.
Yep.
What is surprising about this? It's normal. It was the first thing I learned when I was a child, subject and verb. So the rule of the octave was the same. It's a good confirm on what was quite normal. When I do piano lessons, I listen to my pupils play, and sometimes I say, "Oh, but this is another rule of the octave." So, another one, yeah. The beginning of the first Lied ohne Horte by Felix Mendelssohn.
These are the rules that you see, like, for instance, in Fenaroli, you can find them. How do they cover it up in the 19th century? What kind of romantic dressing do they put over these old patterns?
You can see very well, really, in the music of Chopin, for example. Chopin, you know that has been written out really tons of words about the classicity of Chopin, no? Of how Chopin was a classical author, different from the other romantics. In some senses, was often described like a kind of pupil of Mozart, but
and Bach too, right?
Yeah. But nowadays, it's really interesting to see that we are able to go more in depth to this kind of classicism. It was really related to his education. He was a Poland, so he was born in a Catholic country. Catholicism, obviously, in that times means Italy. It means a strong link with Italian culture and Italian tradition. You know that Felix Diergarten, for example, studied quite in depth these aspects about the apprehension of the young Chopin. They found that the education of Chopin was quite strongly influenced by the Italian tradition. So now we can answer to the classical manner to behave of Chopin in composition. And in the most part of his compositions, if you cross out, as I said before, if you cross out all the chromatical diminution, you can find that the basis, the fundamentals of his compositions remained quite the same of the past. Really, I say nothing about his genius in the way to use that old stuffs. Nobody may discuss about this, but anyway, the language was the same, was quite the same, with a new dressing, as you said before, but it was the same. And today, in my opinion, many people is stressing a lot the aspect of improvisation, obviously the importance that the 18th century tradition had, but it is in some sense self-demonstrated, this kind of importance. It's a fact. But in my opinion, it's quite interesting, the same, to look at what occurred during the 19th century, how this tradition adapted to a new kind of professionalism. Because the problem is not to say if the past is better, the present is worse, so we can continue to...
Bad. It's so bad. It's so bad right now.
That is. So, in my opinion, it's more interesting to look to what occurred and which was the relation between what was needed by a professional during the 19th century, what and how the education changed to give answers to the new necessities.
That's a great, because I really want to ask you about the way you teach Partimento. Maybe we can get to that very quickly. I just have one more question about the 19th century, and that deals with the second part of the chromaticism that we did, that the structure and the harmony. I know in the Paris Conservatory, for instance, Nadia Boulanger, when she was teaching with the Paul Vidal bases, do we see something like that in Partimenti of Raimondi or maybe Boucheron, that they would, structurally, the second type of chromaticism?
You can find something, but it's quite hard to define. For example, not in the Neapolitan, among the Neapolitans, but if you look, for example, the Partimenti of Boucheron, you find a more chromatic way to use partimenti, but in some sense they are partimenti just in name, because Raimondi wrote this particular kind, Boucheron wrote this kind of particular partimenti with the numbers, not only, but with the realization. So you have a double sheet of paper. In the first one, you have the exercise. In the second one, you have the realization. And in the first one, the numbers describe exactly the position of the hands. So you have to do nothing than to look for notes on the keyboard. It's quite a strange way to look at the word of partimenti, but it is explained about what occurred in that years in Milan when Boucheron lived. Milan, was conquered by Napoleon in the first half of 19th century, and it was founded in Milan a conservatory really French-oriented. The conservatory was founded by the French. The books adopted in the conservatory were the translation of the books used in the Paris Conservatory.
That's weird. So the Naples conservatories, they influenced Paris, and now Paris is backwards now.
Yeah. So even if some teachers from Naples went to teach in Milan, the same Milan remained a strongly French-oriented conservatory. So the method they used were quite different from the method of Naples, and you can see this really different way in the Partimenti by Boucheron. And this way was followed by another, in this case, is a Florentine organist, Tacchinardi, who wrote a another collection of Partimenti, some years later than Boucheron, another collection of organ Partimenti, in the same way. So with the numbers that describes the position of the hands on the keyboard, and they are very chromatic partimenti, but the organist had simply to look for notes on the keyboard because the numbers are all written out. So
can you do that with unfigured bases? And can you get kind of like a romantic harmony without figures?
If you are trained for it, probably they did. Organists overall. For example, improvisation in the Italian conservatories at the end of the 19th century disappeared, but was maintained for the organists. They had to continue to study improvisation.
Italian organists.
Italian organists, and it remained as a subject of study until present.
The French organists and I guess the Italian organists, from what you're telling me, they improvise. And is that the way they do it? Could you call that partimenti? So they are doing partimento, 19th century harmony. Yeah.
For the Italians continue to have an apprehension in Partimento during the 19th century. All the Italian composers in the 19th century had to study and to learn Partimento. Not only in Naples, but in the north too. If you think that Verdi studied with Vincenzo Lavigna. Lavigna was a pupil of Fenaroli. So we know that also Pietro Mascagni. Mascagni studied in Milan, but with Saladino. Saladino was a pupil of Pietro Raimondi, so he had to study Partimenti too.
So I guess for us to anchor this, yes, there was 19th century Partimenti. The way it was kind of done just like 18th century Partimenti, but in a 19th century style. People did do it. It started to change into written forms, but the organists were still doing kind of a 19th century Partimenti. And were they, the organists, were they figuring their bases, or did they? You mentioned this just now, right? They did figure the bass.
I have to admit that I didn't study in depth this aspect. I met the figure of Tacchinardi only occasionally for his collection of Partimenti. I believe anyway that the fact that they had to learn Partimento after really influenced their practice. The same. So it wasn't possible to cross out this kind of experience and to do totally in a totally different way after a training like this.
Quick question, Professor Stella: can you do 19th century harmony without thinking of the modern harmony? So, for instance, thinking like figured bass, thinking like basso continuo partimento theory, and not thinking of the fundamental bass, not thinking of chordal invertibility. Is that possible?
It's my opinion. It's easier.
So it is definitely possible, and it's easier, is what you're saying. And we're talking 19th century harmony.
For example, you know that in 18th century, Napolitan maestros knew quite soon the new theories, the new French theories from Rameau and others about the fundamental bass and so on. They knew because we know that copies of the French treatises arrived in Naples quite soon, but they refused this kind of theory because it was really hard for them to understand why I have to consider a kind of now I'm going to joke a little. Why have I to consider a ghost bass? And for a ghost bass, I want to say a bass that I cannot hear, and a not existing bass, a theoretical bass, instead of the real one. The real one is what I hear. The bass fundamental is the ghost
As a ghost.
Missing one. It's something that I have to reconstruct by thoughts, but not by practice. So what utility may I have in this? This kind of approach was still alive in the 19th century. Previously, I forgot to say that when I spoke about tonal counterpoint, I forgot to say that at the very beginning of the 19th century, in the first 2 decades, there was quite a strange situation in which they wrote tonally, but they continued to use the modal theory. If you look, for example, at the counterpoint treatise by Tritto, you can find that he continued to say alla mi re, G sol fa ut, and all the other stuffs of the modals,
old school stuff,
of the modals, modal theory and modal solfège, but in a tonal context. So the theoric language remained the same of the past, but the practice changed. So when we speak about the romantic way to do Partimento, is something like that. The fundamentals of theory remain the same of the 18th century, but the way to realize it, and in some sense, they preserved the
system,
the idea. The system, the ideas. For example, to train the composers in the real form of music. This is an idea. Obviously, the idea was used differently in the times. So, which were the forms used in the 18th century? Fugue, concertos, and so on. And they did Partimenti in concerto form. Which were the forms used in the 19th century? Impromptu, romanza. For example, at the very end of Platania Treatise, you can find the realization by himself of a romanza Partimento, an ABA form, in the style of Bach, perhaps something in the middle of Mendelssohn and some easy composition of Schumann. It's completely a piano piece of music, so real music.
Okay, so now the last section of the interview, I want to talk about teaching Partimento, and you're a very experienced educator, and I really would love to know how you teach Partimento. So basically, what is your recommendation for somebody who wants to start learning Partimento? What should they do?
Oh, yeah. First of all, I have to mention that I had two great occasions to teach Partimento. The first one was in Frosinone Conservatory with some students of musical pedagogy. It was quite interesting. And after that, when I had to teach paleography, musical paleography at Berry Conservatory, and I taught Partimento to students of piano mostly, but not only, of choir conducting too. Perhaps I think that the best solution is to use Fenaroli. I think that it remains the most gradual, and obviously the Durante collection is really beautiful, astonishing in some sense, but Fenaroli I think is more pedagogical, more and follow simply what he says. I know he say not a lot, but the words are really few.
Yeah.
But in his exercises, you can find a lot of. For example, at the very beginning of Fenaroli, first exercise of Fenaroli, he presented the rule. He presented the rule, and inside the exercise number 1, he gives some integration of the rule. So immediately points out that, there is the rule, but be careful. The rule is not the only way to realize it. So the rule is 1, and in the exercise, he wrote some numbers to show that there are other possibilities. So immediately you are put in a way of thinking that is not so dogmatic, and where you have to understand that the rule must be always integrated in the which is the situation you come from and which is the situation you are going to. So in some sense we can speak about I don't know if in English it may be clear, a relational grammar. The grammar is not a static point. So I can assert that a rule is just one, only one, always one. But the rule may be interpreted according to which is the path I'm going in. And this way of thinking of all the maestri is not only by Fenaroli, but Fenaroli is really curious. Exercise number 1, he has ended to present the first rule, and immediately it seems to contradict himself, because I imagine the student saying, but he said differently. He said now differently, and now he presents me another thing. Why? Let me
leads
do the
to
first
a
exercise.
question, which is, for all these gaps and lack of words, is it good to get a teacher to help guide you?
Yeah, you have to think that for Italians, the real treatise, the real book, was the living body of the maestro. So all the collections that we have, it's only in some sense, sketches of things that must be filled in by the voice of a real maestro. This was one of the reasons that. If, for example, if you look at the French tradition is really a book-orientated tradition from Rameau and until present. Big treatises with hundreds of pages of descriptions and so on. This was an element totally unconceivable from in the Italian tradition, because treatises in Italy were for amateurs. In the 18th, in the 19th, and in the 18th and 19th century too, the treatises were mostly for amateur, because the professionals were trained directly from a maestro. You have to think to another mentality. Music was mostly involved in the craftsmanship. So, may I to learn to, I don't know, to become a plumber from a book.
Nice. Learning to swim from a book too.
It's not possible. It's a practical professionalism. So it's not possible to learn it. I can give a glance. I can have an idea, but I cannot really to learn it. Like to paint. May I became like Tintoretto, like Caravaggio, learning from a book? It's totally impossible. Obviously, it's totally impossible the same anyway. But so this was the kind of mentality. To learn music, you need a real maestro, a living maestro, not a book. A book is not useful in this sense.
From your teaching of Partimento, what do you find were the difficult or the challenges that students would find? So you would teach the rule of the octave, you teach cadences, you would teach the voice leading. Where do you find that there was the biggest struggle?
At the very beginning, I can call it the no paper panic. The fact that you have to play something that it doesn't exist yet. You have only the exercise in front of you, but you have to realize, looking at the keyboard, you have not a score. Probably it was the first reaction. It was often this one. But in my experience, for example, when I did my experimentation in Frosinone, I tried really to recreate the situation described by In Bimbo. So I was able to recreate a cooperative class. The more advanced pupils worked a lot with the youngest, and they really helped each other, and it was really a kind of a laboratory in the 18th century or 19th century practice, because I was able to see how this kind of apprehension really made a lot of things easier. For example, really in a quite short time, they changed not only in realizing partimenti, but for example in listen music too. As a pupil told to me once, she told me, now when I listen to music, if in the music there is something I realized at the keyboard, I'm immediately able to recognize it. So the experience of listening music too changed quite in a quite fast way.
I understand what they say. It's really true. It's really true. You listen to music very differently.
Yeah, because one element that, in my opinion, is not often stressed a lot, that a way of learning that made use of touch, look, sight, and hearing, constructed a kind of circle, a kind of sensorial circularity that is able to reinforce the apprehension really in a great way. I don't know, for example, in Singapore or in other countries, but in Italian conservatories, quite often students have to study harmony only at the table, like a silent
like a written
exercise.
A written exam, yeah.
Yeah, a written exam that they are not able to give in their head any sound to what they are writing.
Tell you, we have the exams, the written exams in Singapore, the music board exams. I won't say which board they are, but I'll tell you, in practice, what happens is the students, they buy model answers from past papers.
Yeah.
And that's what they do. That's how they learn their quote-unquote theory. And it's separate, completely separate, because they have performance exam and they have theory exam.
Yeah, it's like to do crosswords. Simply applying rules in the right way, but it's in a way totally unrelated from a real sound, real music. So in this sense, the practice of Partimento it's really a big opportunity for nowadays.
Professor Stella, I want to ask you two big questions to end off. Okay, so first is a piano question, because you're a great pianist. What advice can you give to people to improve their piano playing when playing Partimento? That's my first question.
Yeah, you have, as I pointed out before, the language that the tonal composer used was really founded in the Partimento practice, and overall in the Partimento grammar. The grammar of Partimento was the same grammar of tonal music. If you learn it practically, or anyway, if you learn it, I'm not so totally oriented on the fact that the only way is improvising at the piano. Not everybody probably has the time to devote himself as long as it is needed to achieve that goal. But even if you for example do enough way, for example realizing at the piano, writing at the piano, it's a good way too, in my opinion, because anyway the exercise you are writing as immediately is sound. No, you play. So anyway, playing is essential to me too. But when you play every piece of music that contains a lot of the stuffs that are contained in the Partimento exercises, you are really facilitated in learning, because when you memorize easily, you can read easily, because it's a scheme that you already know. So everything became really more fast in the apprenticeship. At the piano too, because if you look at the Beethoven sonatas, Mozart sonatas, Haydn sonatas, Clementi, and so on, they are so full of elements contained in the Partimento tradition that really you are facilitated. You can understand, for example, how Mozart could write to his sister Nannerl about one of his sonatas. You know the quoting of a letter when he wrote, "This time, please read it before to play this one in public, because it's more difficult than usual." From which we can argue that usually his sister played Mozart sonatas
from sight.
On site reading. How it was possible? It was possible because they were able to recognize immediately probably a 90% of usual stuffs inside the composition. So they had only to concentrate about the other 10%.
What's your reaction to the rise in popularity of Partimento? You mentioned you met Professor Giorgio Sanguinetti in the late 90s, and now this is like 20 years later, and Partimento is like the rage now. So how do you feel just seeing it grow from an idea and just becoming something that a lot of people are interested in, particularly young students as well?
Yeah. I know, but in some sense, I have a double reaction. On one side, obviously, I'm quite enthusiastic about this, because you know that when I was a student, for example, I had to study that Italy in 18th and 19th centuries has nothing like a music theory. For example, it is something like that is stressed in the history of music, in the Cambridge History of Music Theory, that after Padre Martini, after this one of the writers, Italy stopped to have its own musical theory. So fortunately, things are changed, and nowadays we say that we know that it's not the truth. On the other, so I'm quite happy about this. But on the other hand, I'm not totally convinced. It's so easy for, I'm not quite polite in this sense, but for foreigners to understand really how was important not only the practice of Partimenti, but a lot of elements that were around the practice of Partimenti. In this sense, I feel that is great what did Robert Gerdingen with his last books, that in some sense we could describe as a guide for Martians on how. Yeah, it describes a lot of things, for example, that for us Italians is totally
normal.
Totally normal, totally familiar. Perhaps not for all the young people in Italy too nowadays, but for me that I'm 50, a lot of things remained really familiar. As I said,
are you referring to, for instance, like solfeggio, the importance of singing, the importance of all the things around Partimento, counterpoint instead of harmony theory?
Yeah, too. And for example, when I was a child, I began as a child singer in the choir of one of the 4 major cathedrals in Rome. In Santa Maria Maggiore, I had to begin to sing before other...
And singing Gregorian chant as well, and all of this, and that's...
in that period, no Gregorian chant, but I had to learn a lot of masses by Palestrina, Lorenzo Perosi and others. But anyway, singing was an important part of my basic formation. But so obviously this kind of things, but not only, because in my opinion, Robert Gerdingen describes very, very well the social environment in which these things grew up, and are elements that have to be taken in great importance. I give you an example. In Italian tradition, usually the musical teaching it's a one-on-one teaching, one-to-one teaching, or anyway teacher with small classes, 8, 10 pupils. So with a strict personal relation between maestro and pupils, and the opportunity to really to follow the education of the pupils really in depth. Obviously, if you have a 200 people class, it's quite difficult to obtain the same results. So probably must be considered also a reorientation not only of the studies, but of the way the teaching music is done.
So it's not just like one special trick that we can just add into music education. We have to almost consider how we teach music completely, because Partamento is one part of a very comprehensive system that was taught in that time. And to just say that just if we throw in Partamento, suddenly everything is going to be a lot better. But it's really, there's so much solfeggio, there's Partamento, there's counterpoint, all at the same time and for many years and with a direct transmission. Am I getting it?
No, excuse me. For example, singing. Singing for years permitted to absorb physically, in some sense, a lot of elements, knowing nothing about music theory, but simply singing. If you sing in a choir, in a polyphonic choir, harmony, for example, or counterpoint, many elements of harmony and counterpoint is something that you absorbed without knowing. So when you begin to study harmony or counterpoint or whatever you want, for you became normal. It's like to learn a language. The child, a child learns to speak without knowing nothing about grammar, simply listening at his mother or his father. It's. Really, I believe it's quite a different way to look at music apprehension, and it must be considered on the same weight of doing partimenti or hexachordal solfeggi and so on. These are the tools, but the tools, in my opinion, must be detached. Mustn't be detached from other elements that were important too. Like, for example, the organization of School of Music, School of Music.
So, well, what can I say? Just a really fantastic conversation with the brilliant scholar and pianist, Professor Gaetano Stella. Professor Stella, thank you so much for coming on the show. Can you please tell my audience what you have planned for the rest of the year and how they can contact you if they have questions about Partamento and what we talked about on the show?
Pleasure. Then I'm close to begin my master in music. I'm currently teacher of Partimenti and Galant Schemata at the Italian Master of GATM. That is organized together with other organizations, conservatories, universities, and so on. People may contact me at my email, that is gaetano.stella at tiscali.it.
What other plans do you have for the rest of the year?
To teach, of course. We are in the COVID times, so a lot of things are complex now. So we hope things are going better. I think I will have no other public occasions at this moment, but after that we are going to see.
Very good. Well, Professor Stella, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for being on the show, and I hope you had a good time with the questions, and I really would love for you to come back onto the show in the future again, and we can continue this wonderful conversation. So, Professor Stella, thank you so much for coming on the show. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you too. Have a nice day. Bye, and thank you for all the listeners for their attention. Bye.